20. All right. All right. Well, welcome all. Today we're going to talk about business model canvas as a tool. How many have you, those of you here in person, how many of you have ever used the business model canvas or been introduced to it? I see a lot of heads no here. How about online? Give me a thumbs up if you've used the business model canvas. A couple of you. 1, 2, 3. Good. All right. So a few of you have. A lot of you have not. So today I'm going to talk to you about the use of the business model canvas. Now, as an introduction to me, oh, you know what? This doesn't have my slide about me. That is in my new one. But I'll give you an introduction about me. So my name is Will Kaigler, and I am a member of the faculty here at Tepper. I teach entrepreneurship at the undergraduate and graduate level, although right now I'm doing only undergraduate level because I will be going on a leave of absence at the end of this semester because I've got a startup that's becoming overwhelming otherwise. So I'm going to take a year off from teaching and practice what I preach. But today I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite tools. And I've come across this tool a number of different ways. I've used it myself as an entrepreneur, and as an introduction to me, this is now my 4th startup. I did a startup back in the 90s that was a mechanical engineering consulting and manufacturing firm. I did a startup that was a software startup in the healthcare space called MedSage Technologies that I sold to Philips in 2010. I did a startup in the long-term care space, which was an IoT startup for fall prevention for seniors. And now I'm doing what, for lack of a better term, I'll call a reboot of the MedSage startup, the company that I developed, but with new technology and a much bigger vision. So it's in the home healthcare space, and it's an end-to-end treatment platform for a condition called obstructive sleep apnea. So I've done software, I've done mechanical, electromechanical. I'm a mechanical engineer by undergrad, and then I got my MBA here at CMU back in the 90s. I came here specifically because I wanted to learn how to be an entrepreneur because I knew I wanted to start my own company. And so many of the tools that you're going to learn if you get involved in the ecosystem here, which we call lean entrepreneurship techniques, didn't exist back then, but many of us followed them kind of by instinct and by necessity. This tool did not exist, and I wish it had, because it would have helped me in the early days of MedSage tremendously to map out the business model that can be used for a company. And I also, in between all of those different things that I talked about, ran a group called a Vistage group at one time, which is essentially like a peer-to-peer coaching business where CEOs are helping each other with their small businesses. I used this tool a lot there. And that's really where I learned to use this in a very pragmatic way. So for those of you who have been introduced to this before, I have no idea how you've used it or how it was taught to you previously, but chances are pretty good that it was wrong. And I'm going to teach you the right way to use this by doing it, having done it, okay? So it's a simple tool, but if you use it wrong, it can be practically worthless and just a time suck, right? But if you use it properly, it can be a tremendous tool. So the first thing I like to start with, let me see if I can get this thing working right. And now, there we go. That's because I've got all these folks open here. Let me move this over here. So I'm an engineer. Those of you here in front of me, how many of you have technical backgrounds here, are here majoring in engineering or computer science or any of those? So at least half of you, more than half of you. The instinct for anybody coming from that field is to say it's all about the product, right? It's you build a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door. That's the old phrase. And the fact is that the product is important. I happen to be a really I'm all about product and all about customer, but it's also about the business model, and you can differentiate yourself to the successful side or the negative side with a good or a bad business model. So today we're going to talk about how do we map out the proper use of a business model, and the first one is to make this clicker work. I guess I'm abandoning that. So I'm going to use a couple examples. So let's talk about Rosetta Stone. So anybody here in person, are you familiar with Rosetta Stone? So you are. What? Very loudly. What's Rosetta Stone? Yeah. So it was actually the first commercially really successful language learning platform that used computers and used visual inputs rather than the classic way that I learned Spanish back in the day when I was a student, right? Which would be, learn your vocabulary words and then figure out how to structure them in a sentence and so forth. Rosetta Stone was the first to say, let's use technology to pattern how you learn a different language from the way a baby learns their first language, right? And they were innovators from that perspective. So they definitely had a big innovation from a product perspective. They were founded in 1992. As I said, they were the leader in digital language, but they are also innovators in their sales channel. So this is the kiosk that used to be in every airport all over the country, right? You'd get off your plane and you'd always see one of these, right? And they were there to cater to the business traveler who wanted to learn a different language, and by the way, had the income to support spending $300, $400, $500 on a tool like this. And that's what this cost to use. Now, remember, 1992, there was no internet per se. Yeah, it certainly was not widespread yet. And so they had a premium pricing strategy, and that's part of the reason they used airports as their distribution channel. And it worked well for them. It made them the leader, right? Until something happened. So what happened? Because Rosetta Stone's not the leader anymore. So what happened? Anybody have a guess? Anybody on the chat, maybe? What do you think? So Google Translate kind of goes back to the vocabulary technique, right? But I'm talking about using this same picture and behavioral based, the way a baby learns a new language. There was a product that came out that changed this market forever. What do you think? Duolingo, yeah, CMU, right? Right here, right? And as a matter of fact, over in Project Olympus was where it was started, right? So Duolingo changed everything. So what did they do? Well, they gamified language learning, but fundamentally their approach was not tremendously different than Rosetta Stone, right? The product was an improvement over Rosetta Stone, but not revolutionary in terms of its approach, right? It was Louis von Ahn, a professor in our computer science school, founded it in 2011, his second company, by the way. But there were some technology differences. So there were some product differences, right? It leveraged the internet, it leveraged the cloud, and it was free, right? So now we're getting into some business model differences. You could download Duolingo. I have it on my phone. Many of you probably have it on your phone. And you can start using this for free. And then over time, there are incentives built into it to get you more engaged with it and eventually get you to start paying a subscription for it, right? And now it just got its funding last winter at $1 billion valuation. People like to say it's the first unicorn in Pittsburgh. That's BS. There's other great companies like Respironics, like Medtronics, that are Medrad, that were unicorns many years before. But it's the most recent one, and it's a great company. And I know a lot of people there, right? It wasn't really the product that changed it. It was leveraging technology to create a new delivery model with a different business model, right? So business model, at a minimum, was a big contributor to what made them different and what made them successful in order to be able to take over that market. By the way, I mentioned that Luis founded Duolingo as his second company. His first company was a company called reCAPTCHA. So does anybody remember what reCAPTCHA does? Go ahead. I was waiting to see if anyone else, but go ahead. Yeah? Yeah, so you're proving the fact that you're a human being rather than a robot, right? And the way it's doing that There's really two different ways it's doing that. The first one is the one that you referenced, which is that you have to go in there and you see these squiggly lines that are sometimes poorly written, and you have to duplicate the text. So what are you doing when you do that? Does anybody know? Why do they ask you to do that? Other than the fact that they want to prove that you're a human being, not a robot. Yeah, so you're transcribing old print, usually from newspapers like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, who have been around for decades, right? And have all this print, but don't have it digitized. So what you don't realize is you're being a free labor source for them by way of doing so. And those are the people that are paying for your service, paying for the service, right? So it's not the e-commerce company and it's not you as the consumer, it's that third party. Now they were also sold to Google. That's why they're called Google reCAPTCHA now. And Google is now using it to train computer vision and AI, right? So now that's why you see pictures that say, you know, click the boxes that have street lights or stop signs, those sort of things, right? But it's the same idea. The only difference now is Google's training their own AI with it, right? So I think I covered those things while I did it, right? So I would make the argument that there was really no earth-shattering technology innovation from reCAPTCHA. The earth-shattering innovation was the business model, right? They were the ones who figured out how to find somebody else to pay for this, right? That's business model, that's not product. And what about Apple? So Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak founded Apple way back in the 70s, the Stone Ages. Most of you weren't even born then. You know, it was on the wave of personal computing. What made it unique at the time was that it was a single platform. They did the hardware and the software, whereas you had Microsoft doing operating systems and being only software, and you had people like IBM and Dell and Gateway, and the list goes on and on and on, right, of hardware companies. Steve said, you know, look, the operating system and the hardware should be together. They should work seamlessly. The customer gets a better experience, and that's how we really drive this to the consumer market, right? That was their unique premise, right? And yes, it influenced their product, but it was also part of their strategy of who they were going after. Now, of course, Steve was fired in 1985, and Apple did fantastic after Steve was gone, right? No, it went down the tubes. In fact, it almost bankrupted itself until, out of an act of desperation, they rehired this crazy guy, Steve Jobs, in 1996 and said, can you save us? The company was nearly insolvent at that point. I wish I had bought stock back in 1996. I probably wouldn't be here today. No, I would be here because I love being here. And of course, Steve came in and said, let's do something different again, right? And he said, let's adopt a mobile strategy. The first wave of Apple was based upon the growth of personal computing. The second wave was based upon mobile technologies and saying, I can make an iPod and I can make it better. I can make a cell phone and combine it with an iPod and make it better, and actually make it practically a computer, right? Many of the United States public use their iPhone. It's the only computer they have, right? And so he introduced the iPod in 2001, the iPhone in 2007, and today it's, you know, when I put this slide together, they were the most valuable company in the world. I'm not sure if that's still true, but they're very close, right? And much of that is because of how they looked at the market and how they looked at their business, and then they let the product follow, right? So my last example, I think it's my last example, yes, is IKEA. Because I don't want this, I know everything at CMU is about tech, right? But it's not always about tech. IKEA is not a technology innovation, right? They're actually a very old company. They date back all the way to 1926, prior to at least the Second World War, maybe the First World War, right? And from Sweden, and they really transformed their business in the 80s when they decided to change their business model and essentially outsource the assembly of their product to us, right? They would make a better product that was easy to assemble. And if you put it together, you had a pretty high quality product. They didn't care if it took a lot of work to assemble because you were free as far as they're concerned. And I don't know if you've ever put IKEA stuff together, but it ain't easy to assemble, right? That's not one of their design requirements, right? But they could create valuable, high quality products at a reasonable price. And it had influences all the way through the supply chain, right? They're shipping boxes instead of couches now, right? And now they can manufacture it in lots of different places and change the whole business model, right? So that premise changed their business, had nothing to do with technology, right? It had to do with how they look at their business. So those are my examples. That's my premise of why you need to pay attention to business model. I hope I convinced you if you weren't already convinced. So now I want to switch gears and take you through this tool. And I'm going to start by introducing you to one of my mentors. So Don Jones is one of the first entrepreneur professors here at Carnegie Mellon. He was my professor when I was a student here. He's also a great entrepreneur in his own right, has founded multiple companies in the robotic space. He's since passed away. He's Dave Mawhinney's mentor, and to a little lesser extent mine. Dave founded a company with him. In fact, he's over there on he's the founder of the entrepreneurial studies program here at CMU as well. And he liked to say this to me all the time. He'd say, and he called me Bill, not Will. He'd say, Bill, don't make business so complicated, right? Keep it simple. Simple ideas, simple approaches always end up being the best approaches. And I'm going to do that as I take you through this tool today. So here's the business model canvas. So a couple things that you should notice about this business model canvas. There's 9 boxes. This is why on my very first slide, I said more than just a checkbox. Because you could go through here and you could fill out these boxes and say, I did a business model canvas. And that's what most big companies do. They just fill it out so they said they could use it. And then they don't ever look at it again. And that's pretty much a waste of time, right? It's not worthless, but it's one step above worthless. So there's 9 boxes. I'm going to show you the right way to use it. So there's customer segments, there's relationships with your customers, there's channels of how you get to your customers, what the value proposition is, how you're going to sell it, what's going to cost, how you're going to manufacture, what partners, et cetera, right? Everything you need to think about with a business model is in this document. So from that standpoint, it's a good checklist to make sure you think about everything. But now let's talk about how you best use it. So the first thing I want you to think about is there's actually 2 sides to this tool. On the right, everything is focused on the customer, on value, and it's externally focused. While on the left, everything is internally focused and focused on you, your company, and how you're going to deliver a product and hopefully actually make some money at it while you're doing it, right? You need both of those to build a sustainable company. So it's focused right side customer, external, left side company, internal, right? Now, I'm going to show you how I use this tool, and you should use it in this order, right? Because it's important. The order is important. The first step is to define your customer. Now, when I say define your customer, I don't mean just, we're going to sell to people who want to learn Spanish, right? It's defining the specific segments within the customer with as much detail as you can. How many of them are there? What do they do today? How would you segment this market? The more you segment this market, the better picture you have of what your customer looks like and the value that they achieve from it. By the way, how am I doing time-wise? How much time do I have? 40 minutes? Okay, good. Everything, by the way, you could download this document off the internet. Just put business model canvas. Strategizer has what I think is the best one because it has a lot of detail on it. But what I'm showing here in these slides breaks everything that are in those teeny little letters there, those teeny little words are in my boxes, right? So define as much as you can on every segment of your market and your customer. That's where you start. Detail is important. Now, after you've done that, you take a jump to the left, to the middle. And for each customer segment, you define the value proposition. What's the benefit? What are they getting out of it? And be as quantifiable as you possibly can in defining that. And what I mean by that when I say quantifiable is the better you can do to characterize the value in numbers, the better off you'll be. So how is value generated? Well, value is time, money, and relationships. Now, the relationships part is a little harder to generate, but even that, typically, you can monetize, you can quantify in some way. And by the way, I would argue that time is money anyway, right? So it comes down to, in many cases, dollars and cents. If you can get it down to that, you're really, really understanding what the value proposition is that you're generating. And you need to do that for every customer. So I mentioned that I started a company called MedSage in the home healthcare industry that I sold to Philips. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on MedSage, but essentially we used automated phone calls, which is antiquated now. I would never do it that way now, to follow up with senior citizens and sell them medical supplies. And it actually worked. Most people don't think that would work, but it did. But we sold it to home healthcare providers whose job it was to make sure they had those supplies. We did not get paid by the patients. And we didn't get a transaction fee. That's actually against the law in the United States. So we sold the home care providers, and yet patients were also our customer. Why? Because if they hated what we were doing and complained to their home care company, we would not have a customer, right? So I use that illustration to explain to you that not all value propositions are propositions you get paid for, but there needs to be a benefit for every customer involved. In my case, the benefit for the patient was they got better care, they had a better quality of life, that sort of thing, right? For every customer segment, there should be a value proposition. Now, this is where you can start to really simplify this process. So you want to have everything quantified as much as possible. And the important point here is, and this is a subtle point that so many people forget, it has to be relative to their alternatives, right? So when I teach my entrepreneurship class, I always have a group of students who say we have no competition. And I always stop them dead in their tracks right there, because that is never the case. You always have, your customer always has alternatives. Their alternative may be doing nothing. That's still an alternative, right? There's always an alternative. So you have to measure the value incrementally above what the alternatives are that the customer enjoys, right? For each one. Then you go to defining how you're going to generate revenue from this. Now, you notice in my green box here, I have no details, but down below there's a ton, right? I want to talk about revenue before we go into the detail on this. So somebody here or online, and you can monitor, tell me what revenue is. What's revenue to you? Yeah. Okay, so it's sales that you derive from your product as in return for a service you provide. Okay, pretty good definition. Any online? These online people need to get going. Online people, I'm watching you. We're watching you. Anybody else here want to try? Yeah, we got one. Making sales. Okay, that's kind of a derivative of what he said. Anybody else? Payment for value provided. I like that one. Yeah, well, and of course, they're all very closely related. So none of those are wrong, right? But at its most simple sense, revenue is how your customer rewards you for whatever you're doing for them, right? So it is their measure of the value, right? They either recognize it or not. And if they don't recognize it, then it's not valuable, right? So it's how they recognize the fact that you're doing something valuable for them. And it really should be, wherever possible, quantifiable, right? So when we talk about how do we look at revenue now, it it becomes a really simple calculation. And everything I've ever done when I started a company all started on the back of a napkin. And I'm not kidding, right? Everything needs to be simple enough that you can figure out, just with a pen and pencil, pen and paper, right? So let's use an example. So I have a customer, and my hypothesized solution, I believe, is going to generate $100 worth of value for that customer. And now I'm going to introduce a concept called goodness factor. Have any of you ever been exposed to goodness factor yet? So goodness factor is a concept developed and introduced by Don Jones, who I introduced earlier. And essentially what goodness factor is if you make a product and it provides a value, it has to be significantly more valuable than the competitive alternatives. It can't be just a little bit better. It has to be a lot better, right? Because every one of us have switching costs. We're all lazy, right? We're not going to just switch because it's a teeny bit better or because you like me or you like her. It doesn't matter. It has to be a lot better, right? And Don used to say, however you calculate value, it should be at least 3 times better. That's what he used to say when I was a student here. I would say that's actually gotten more extreme now. It's probably closer to 10, but it's certainly somewhere between 3 to 10. So MedSage was at least a 5, right? And we did very well with that, right? You want to try to get to a 10x increment in value, right? So in this case, we're going to say 10x, right? That's what we're going to aim for. So if we're generating $100 of value, and we have to be 10x better than the alternative, or what we're going to charge them in this case, then it's pretty simple math, right? 100 divided by 10, we can't afford to charge this customer any more than $10 for that product, right? If you want them to overcome the switching costs and actually change what they're doing, right? And all of this is relative to the competition, right? So I started with customer, and then I defined value, and now I'm defining my share of that value, right? So $100 of value is split up $90 customer, $10 me. That might sound unfair, but that's the way the world works, right? So with a 10x goodness factor, now if it was a 3x goodness factor, maybe I could charge $33, but it's somewhere in that range. It's 10 to $33. And I can actually take that number, and if I know how many customers there are in that segment, I can get a good idea of how big this market is. Right, so $10 in this case times, let's say 10 million customers. This is a $100 million market opportunity. Why is that important? You're planning out a business here, right? You want to go after a business that's the 6 of us in this room plus the other 20 that are online? You say no. I mean, you might, but you all better be really valuable, right? You better all be worth couple $1 million at least each, right? You want to make sure that whatever market you go after, you're going after something that's worth your time, right? In fact, this guy right here is Jeffrey Goldblum from one of my favorite movies. I like to use his quote. I actually love this quote from this movie. Do you remember when the guy who started the park asked him what he thought? Do you remember what he said? What did he say? Exactly, right? You said your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could do something that they forgot to ask whether they should, right? This is your opportunity as an entrepreneur to say, should I do this, right? Because the most valuable asset you have in life is time, right? Don't waste your time on non-valuable activities. You have to use this opportunity to make that assessment, right? And quantify it. And the more you quantify it, the less emotion is in the equation, and every entrepreneur is emotional about their idea, right? So try to factor that out as much as possible. So now with all that said, now I can look at pricing, right? And I can say all these things about revenue streams, right? I have all these options. I could sell it as an asset. I could sell a subscription fee. I could sell it by advertising. I could do fixed pricing or dynamic pricing. And all of that is good and pretty cool stuff. And I'm going to now surprise you and tell you that I don't think you should care about that. Not in the early stages of your business plan. The reason for that is whatever you pick off this menu will be wrong, almost for sure. You don't know enough in the early stages to figure out what your pricing is. And I tell you not to waste your time worrying about it. What you should worry about is what's the value and how much can I extract, right? And still have a goodness factor that would get people to move on it. And I'll worry about exactly how I extract that 10 bucks later on, right? That will come because it will be wrong in the beginning anyway. Trust me, I changed my pricing 4 times at MedSage, at least. So now we've covered the first 3 boxes. I've spent all this time on the first 3 boxes. And I'm going to run out of time, right? Not really, because we're going to go over the last 6 pretty quickly. The reason I spend so much time on the first 3 is they are by far the most important. If you get these wrong, you will have wasted your time through the rest of your process. You do it in this order: customer, value, my share of the value, right? And what do you know just from these 3 boxes? Well, hopefully we understand our customer in a lot of detail, right? We know who we're going to sell to. We know who might be benefiting in other ways. We understand how that benefit is going to be manifest itself and quantified. And we understand if the market's big enough for our time. But there's one other thing we understand that's not quite so obvious. Anyone want to take a guess what the 4th less obvious thing is? What other thing do we know out of the first 3 boxes? For sake of time, anybody online have a guess? Okay, go ahead. Say again. So you should know about your competitive landscape in assessing the value in the customers, but that's not what I was looking for. That's actually, in my opinion, that's part of the understanding the customer and the competitive landscape. I'll tell you what it is, because nobody ever guesses, right? Here's what you also know. You know what you don't know, right? Because what this will do is it will identify all your gaps. If you don't understand how big one customer segment is, it's going to make that obvious. If you don't understand how to quantify the value for a particular customer segment, it's going to make that obvious, right? And it's going to identify those gaps. And that's okay. That's actually one of the beautiful parts of this tool, is that you can highlight the areas you need to spend more time doing more due diligence and more research and more analysis, right? So understanding what you don't understand is probably the most important thing that you get out of this tool on the first pass. Now, we're going to go through the other 6 a lot more quickly, not because they're not important, but because they're not as important. You can screw these up too, but if you don't get the first 3 right, you could recover on customer relationships. As a matter of fact, I made a mistake with this on my company MedSage that I recovered from, because I could create enough value that I could add another service, right? So customer relationships are how your customer wants to work with you going forward. Do they need a customer service team? Do they need a person to talk to? Or is this something they can just sign up for themselves, like Facebook, right? Facebook's probably a bad example after yesterday, but is it a do-it-yourself service? Is it a B2B, business to business, where it has to be a very rich relationship throughout the entire length of that engagement? Is it a one-time transaction? All of those things are incredibly important. And if you get them wrong, you stand the risk of degrading the value of your product, or having to incur extra costs later on, which is what happened with me with MedSage. I had to create an account management service to give them benchmarks and outcomes tools and data, so that I could continually help them improve the use of the product. Otherwise, they just kind of started to ease off on their best practice usages. I didn't anticipate that, but I was fortunate enough to be able to add it later, right? If I knew that up front, it would have been even better. Customer channels. How's the customer know you exist? How do they buy the product? How do you deliver the product, right? After sales, how is it supported? That's the one area that it overlaps a little bit with customer relationships. As a matter of fact, if I were redoing this canvas, I'd probably leave the bottom one out to avoid confusion, because so many students get confused between customer relationships and customer channels because of that last little level of overlap, right? But what I want you to remember is customer relationships is how you work and what your customers' expectations are long-term in working with your company and your group. And channels is how do they buy the product and how do you deliver it? Now we switch over to the left side. So what do we have to be good at? Do we need a distribution center? Do we need a manufacturing facility? Do we need a bunch of software engineers? Right? What have to be our core expertise? And then what are the key resources that support that? And by the way, hopefully we don't have to do everything ourselves. Hopefully there's some partners who can help us. So when I did MedSage back in the day, we used automated phone calls. I had to work with a company out of Orlando to develop voice recognition technology specific to what I was trying to do. Nowadays, I just buy it from Twilio, right? Now there's a partner that I can use to do this. So that changes over time. You always want to leverage other people's expertise to your benefit, right? And then the last step is the cost that brings all of that together, because everything that I just went over in lightning speed is what comes down to what it costs to deliver this product. And you've got to be able to deliver this product at a cost that allows you to make money. So if you remember the back of the napkin, here we are again, except we're starting at the end of where we started before. So our revenue, our unit revenue is $10 in my example, right? So I better be able to deliver this thing for, $3, maybe at the most $4, so that I can generate a margin of $6 or $7, right? That's just direct margin. That doesn't even count my overhead. And the way I like to look at this part is, again, back to Don Jones, keep things simple, is figure out your direct margin. So what's the incremental dollar value that I bring to the bottom line of my business? And then how much money, if I sold that to everybody, does that generate? And is that enough to support all the R&D, all the facilities, all the overhead, all the indirect costs that I know I'm going to have? Right? This is another go, no go decision point, because business is not a charity. Even not-for-profit businesses are not a charity, right? You have to be able to sustain yourself. So this is another point where you have to justify whether it makes sense. I don't know why that's in there twice. So I'm going to wrap up here with my last advice for business model canvas. The first thing is the business model canvas is your internal business plan. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is this is a tool for you and for your team to plan your business out. It is not necessarily something you go share with investors. If investors want to invest in your company and they want to see your internal business plan, then you show them this and you take them through it. That's fine. That's called due diligence, right? But this is for you and your team to plan out, identify the gaps, close those gaps, and refine the business plan. The second thing is you need to be as specific as you possibly can, and quantification is always preferable. Start with customers and value proposition, and use the order that I presented. Now, I mentioned that the number 4 point here is you now know what you don't know, which is a really important thing. Why is that important? It helps you prioritize risks, right? So as an entrepreneur, many people who have never done entrepreneurship think, oh, entrepreneurs are comfortable with risk. Most of them are not, right? They may be a little more comfortable than some people, right? But the best entrepreneurs are great at managing risk and mitigating risk, right? So it starts with identifying where your gaps are here and focusing on them, right? It helps you prioritize. If there's a key customer that I don't know enough about, or there's a key point that I haven't identified yet, or I don't know exactly how to quantify their value, I better work on that before I go build a prototype or go raise money. Focus on customer and value first. Now, next thing, this is not a one-time thing. So the way I recommend using this is you put this up on a wall as big as I have it here, if you can get a wall that big. And I like to use a really old-fashioned technique. I get red, yellow, and green stickies and a Sharpie, and I write on the items and I put them on the wall. So if I have a customer segment, I'm going to put it in this customer box right here. And if I know everything I need to know about them, it's going to go on a green Sharpie. If I've got some questions, it will be on a yellow. And if I got a really high risk item, it's going to go in there on red. By way of doing that, my whole team, when they walk in, can immediately see what they need to be focusing on, where the risks are. And by the way, I answer a couple questions and I can turn that red green. That's what you hope happens, right? And so this changes over time. This is not a one-time thing. This becomes a tool that stays on the wall essentially forever, right? As long as your business is your business. And it will evolve every day for years upon years, right? Now, over time, it will become more and more green, hopefully. But I've worked with many CEOs who say, well, I've got a new opportunity I want to evaluate, and they create a second one over here on another wall and do the same thing, right? It's a tool that can be used, and it's a collaborative tool that the entire team can use and change over time. Any questions? I have no idea how I did time-wise. How are we doing time-wise? 15 minutes. Any questions from those of you in person or online here? Yes. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. So goodness factor is a very basic concept, right? It's essentially what Don Jones said to me, which was that when you make a product, it better be significantly better in however you measure it over the competitor or the competitive alternatives. Don't get hung up with the number as much as the concept, right? There's too many times that people come up with a product, they fall in love with it, and they go talk to their customers and they go, well, yeah, it's better, but it's only a little better. And you say, well, would you switch? They go, I don't know. It's interesting. By the way, I hate that word, interesting. It's my least favorite word in the English language. I wish we could abolish it. Because you know what that is? That's just a delay. That's just a delay to not make a decision because you don't want to say no. I'd rather have somebody tell me no. So it needs to be significantly better. Now, why is it characterized in numbers? Because I really want to challenge you to quantify your value proposition, right? Because the better you do that, the better you're going to understand what's going on in your business, right? And almost every value proposition can be turned into numbers in one form or another, right? I mean, even Facebook, right? You can look at that and say, why do I have a Facebook account? I'm not sure why I have one at all anymore. But originally when I established one, it's because I had a son in Los Angeles and a daughter in Gettysburg and kids all over the place. Now I have a stepdaughter in Scotland and another in New York, right? It's a great way to keep in touch with, you know, my family that may not be living on the same street as the way we all used to, right? So that's a relationship value. But that could still be quantified by how often I go on there, whether I buy products through there. There's a lot of different ways you can quantify what happens within Facebook, right? And you need to be able to look at that and do that. And so the reason that Don characterized it with a number and that Dave and Craig and I always continue to characterize it that way is because we want you to be challenged to quantify your value proposition, even when it's not so easy to do so, right? So if you're going to save somebody money, that's easy. If you're going to save somebody time, it's easy. But how do I quantify the fact that a patient's quality of life is improved with my product MedSage? Well, I can quantify it by how often they reorder supplies. I can quantify it by what percentage of them stay compliant on their therapy, right? And I can quantify what that means economically to my customer, right? So even that can come back to numbers in one form or another. Does that answer your question?
So if it's getting your biggest factor to be quantified what your customers really getting value out of it.
I don't disagree with anything you just said, and I'm not sure the rest could hear, but basically he described the process of starting with customer surveys and then doing more analysis and doing more research. And I don't disagree with anything you just said there. I will caution against one thing, and that is using customer surveys can be dangerous, right? Because all you're doing is asking them what they think. And I don't trust what people say. I trust what people do, right? So I would much rather figure out a way to do a test that determines if this value proposition at this price will actually make somebody change what they're doing, rather than asking them, would you buy this if I charge this amount or whatever, right? People just aren't honest. I mean, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Like they don't want to tell you what, that your baby's ugly, that your product's not as cool as you think it is, right? They want to tell you the easiest thing they can so that they can go back to doing what they're doing, right? Right? But if you do a test and they pony up money or they don't. So I just did a test with my product SovaSage. I've done it actually in 2 separate cities, where I did a Facebook ad, and then we did, so I measured the clicks, so impressions, then clicks, and then conversions, right? The first test I did in Atlanta, I got really great click-through rate, okay, conversion rate. I changed how we did it in Seattle, got similar click-through rate and actually worse conversion rate. So now I know what's working and what doesn't, and I did that, like the whole thing cost me like $200, right? So doing quick tests to understand what people actually value, I recommend way more than the questions in the surveys. It doesn't hurt to do that, but I would rather have a discussion with a potential customer and say, is this mouse going to help you? Oh, what if I did that? Have a discussion of what they would do with that mouse and what problem they're trying to solve. And a lot of times it'll take you in directions you never imagined. Right? You can't do that in a survey where they're just answering questions. Any other questions? How about online? Any? Yep. So the question was, I guess I should look down here. The question was, do I recommend using the business model canvas before customer discovery, during, or after? Anybody want to guess what I'm going to say? So the answer is, I reject the question. I reject the premise of the question. And it's important. I'm not trying to be hard on whoever asked it. But I am to make a point. The business model canvas is the beginning, middle, and end of all business planning, is my premise, right? So you start right in early days, figure out what you think your customers look like. It's going to identify gaps, go do customer discovery, close those gaps, move on to value proposition. And by the way, jump back to customer discovery and probably pricing, right? It's a tool that evolves through that entire process. So a nicer way to answer your question would be yes, right? Which means yes in the beginning, yes during customer discovery, yes after customer discovery, yes always, right? It's an evolving tool that you should just keep and always make better. Other questions? Yes. So the question was, what's the difference between the business model canvas and what you would show investors, and will there be a section on this? And I'm sure there is, because someone's doing a section on how to do an investor pitch, right? So the investor pitch is what you're going to talk to the investors about. And they're going to either buy off on what you're doing and like what you're doing and think that it's an area that there's a lot of reasons why an investor would be interested or not interested. But if they're interested, then they're going to want to understand your business in more detail. And that's when you're going to share some or all of the details of the business model canvas, right? So the pitch, it used to be, I used to write when I was a student here, this big long business plan. It was like this thick. And you'd give it to the investor and they would read it. And by the way, if it changed, then you had to go change it. And then you had to tell them it was obsolete and give them a new one. It was a pain in the butt. Right? Nobody does it that way now. Right? So we have an investor pitch, which includes a slide deck, which includes an executive summary. And then you have internal, and you've got a financial plan, you've got a business model canvas, you've got all the raw data that comes out of your customer discovery and all the little tests that I just talked about, right? Those are all part of what you can share as part of the due diligence process, right? You don't share that as part of the investor pitch unless they ask, and then you can take them as deep as they want to go, right? That's the way it should work. Anything else? Well, so you're kind of doing that as you're doing the business model canvas, right? So by the way, the question was, how do you evaluate multiple business model alternatives for the same product, right? And what's the best tips on how to do that? And the answer is, you go through and you evaluate that by filling out the business model canvas, and it will become self-evident. You're going to have decision points that you're going to have to make there. You could have competing alternatives. Those are things that could be yellow or red with the stickies that I talked about earlier. And you could, if you wanted to, create a separate business model canvas for each if they're really that different. But frankly, usually that's not the case. Usually there's subtle differences. And by analyzing it and using the technique that I used here, you're going to end up with a business opportunity sizing. You're going to end up with a profitability sizing. You're going to understand what your risks are, and that's going to tell you which direction you ought to go. That's what this tool actually helps you do. Any other questions? I have literally no idea how we're doing time-wise. So we close? Wow, look at that. No other questions? One more, okay. Okay, so let me see if I understand this question properly. Essentially what they're asking is, does the business model canvas work as a tool effectively? I'm actually going to broaden this question a little bit. Effectively for any type of business, whether it's a hardware business, a software business, an online business, a virtual business, or, and this is how the person asked it, perhaps a brick and mortar business that's going virtual because of changes in the marketplace like COVID. And the answer is yes, right? So everything that you have to consider is part of that, where is it here? That template, whatever. Forget about the green part there, right? You still have to think about customers. You still have to think about value proposition. You still need to think about how you deliver it and what key resources you're going to need. And they may change if you're trying to go virtual, right? So to give you an example, when I did MedSage, we actually spent a lot of money going out and visiting customers. We did deployments in person. We did sales calls in person. We went to lots of shows. I've spent a fraction of that money on SovaSage because I'm doing it all on Zoom. And I have no intention to go back to that again, right? Neither do our customers. They would much rather not have to host me for lunch and spend the whole day with me than spend an hour to 90 minutes on Zoom and make a decision. Now, my product, allows me to do that, right? Because it's actually a software product and it's a virtual in-service tool, so it fits really well with that. But so many businesses are realizing they don't have to do all that kind of physical travel, don't have to have physical offices. I would hate to be in commercial real estate these days. I can't believe the bottom hasn't dropped out yet, but it's only a matter of time. And the premises change, the hypotheses change, how you deliver the product changes, but the fundamental things you worry about, which is what the business model canvas helps you with, don't change. Okay. If there are no other questions, I think we're done.